Satisfaction is not the word that would first come to mind to describe the attitudes of the people that I know and the families that I live with in Shonai about the current order.
William Kelly has been making periodic research trips for nearly 20 years to the northern Japanese rice-growing region of Shonai. In his earlier books and articles, he described the evolution of irrigation systems in Shonai since the 17th century and the spread of popular protest movements across the region in the 19th century. More recently, he has been writing about the quality of life in regional Japan and about the complex ties that both join and separate regional society and the central state. Dr. Kelly is professor of anthropology in Yale University, and today he talks about regional issues with another anthropologist, series host David W. Plath.
Why Shonai? Why Yamagata? And maybe we should locate it, because if we're here in Tokyo, you're up to the north 200 kilometers?
Or so.
Yeah, tremendously cold and snowy in the winter, right? All these Siberian...
Yes.
Why Shonai? What got you there?
Well, it was a very long series of contacts and introductions that brought me from Boston, Massachusetts to Tsuruoka, the castle town. It wasn't the ski. The rice and the rice wine may have had something to do with it. But I think if I count just the direct links between Boston and Tsuruoka, there were at least 10 people who passed me along one to another in the course of 5 or 6 months.
You may have won the prize, though, for the number of links in the chain. I think my first field work might have been 5 or 6. Before this whole chain explosion began, had you decided you definitely wanted to go to the Northeast, for example?
No, actually, I mean, along the way, there were various other introductions, and in retrospect, on the basis of very naive and incomplete information, I was making choices all the time as to meeting 2 people and following up one, and then from that person meeting another. It was a series of roads not taken. I had a certain scale in mind. I also wanted a place where there had been some local history done, and Shonai turned out to be a place with a very active circle of local high school teachers and other interested antiquarians who eventually very enthusiastically came to instruct me in the ways of local history. And I also wanted a place where the people whom I was meeting seemed interested and willing to tolerate the presence of a foreign researcher.
What was the initial question? Or had you carved out some particular topic that you expected to focus on during the initial foray?
Well, yes, again, for reasons as much strategic as intellectual. I was in graduate school at Brandeis, which had nothing in Japanese studies, certainly not in my department of anthropology. And so I was interested in some topic that would provide a common conversation with my advisors who were frantically looking at the map to find out where it was I was headed. And I happened to pick on the topic of irrigation, how people used water, water organizations. It connected hundreds of villages across this plain in very elaborate networks that were not just natural canals, but also social obligations and political rights. And there was a long history to it. So I thought that that could be an entry into understanding the dynamics of the local society. In the second project, I ended up using popular collective protest as an instance or a set of instances that would highlight certain changes in or certain transformations of local politics and economy. This, again, getting into it always surprises one at the sort of the magnitude of local activity that very slowly emerges from the documents. But this was the last of a series of 4 of these protests involved tens of thousands of local people, farmers and townspeople and shopkeepers and wealthier merchants, in a multi-year series of gatherings, assemblies, protests, in which they would occasionally barge in on a local official and hold him hostage for a number of days until he issued a public apology and donated a certain amount of food to the masses, as well as a very astute legal campaign in the new capital of Tokyo that made use of these new legal channels of the Meiji government to mount a legal suit against the local government that ran to tens of thousands of pages.
Had you had any training in the use of old documents before this? Was this something you had to bootstrap?
This
Because
was a bootstrap operation, although there was someone else pulling me up by my bootstraps, which was a local high school Japanese history teacher who was also the author of several of these local town histories. This was a time in the 70s when the old houses, the old farmhouses, were being torn down. And as the people like this fellow, these local historians, looked around the plain and saw these fires, they realized that what was going up in smoke, in part, were all these documents that had been in the kura or between the walls. And they started scavenging Shonai to collect these, put them together in a local archives, and then started producing all of these town histories. Again, it happened all over Japan, but Shonai was particularly diligent in doing this before they were all burned off.
Well, you know, as you've documented for Shonai, and as you know from many regions in Japan, a long history of locally mounted protests. Any sense that we're moving into an era where protest might be forthcoming again?
Well, again, I tend to draw back from any sorts of projections, but their frustrations are directed in a number of different directions, and so for that reason, it's hard to imagine in the near future very much collective and effective protest against a single target. Agriculture is a good example. Aside from the ritualistic and well-choreographed late spring, early summer rallies by the part-time farmers, they have not been able to mount any united protests, except for a few isolated regional examples, against the changing agricultural policy.
Are we into a major turning point in center-region relations now in Japan? Sometimes I look at the evidence and it seems like there's a major change coming. Other times I look at it, it almost seems kind of superficial.
At various moments in the recent past, when there was a similar choice in the 1950s, everyone seemed to be wanting to come to the cities, and the countryside was going to disappear, and it was going to be one vast urban expanse. And in fact, mechanization of farming didn't produce that entirely. The changes weren't as total as that, and regional Japan survived in rather different form. In the 1970s, so much was made of the age of localism and local government, and there was once again the effort by the Japanese government to redistribute and relocate industry and population and government functions to various parts of Japan outside of Tokyo. And there were some consequences to that for the local areas, but certainly not those as radical as envisioned by the national planners. And we seem to be at a similar point now. I would say that the recent past would suggest it's not going to be quite as dramatic as we might imagine at the present time.
Yeah, but it's like the name of the game seems to be changing.
In what way is that?
I'll way overstate it, but it's almost as if the center, though no political figure, government official will come out and say this openly, it's as if they've said, let's just forget about agriculture. We can import food more cheaply. I mean, yes, sure, there will continue to be agriculture in various forms, but then what are we going to do with the regions? Well, let's turn them into one big playground.
I guess my feeling is it's not so much that the demise of agriculture has been greatly exaggerated, but the presence of agriculture has been greatly exaggerated. Yes, I think
Good.
you're right,
Good.
that the national government is even more serious now than it was 10 years ago about eliminating subsidies to agriculture, which it understands full well is to eliminate most viable agriculture, as well as the even more important part-time farming,
Right.
which depends even more greatly on the national subsidies and credits and the like. But in fact, agriculture has for some time not been that important economically in most of those regions. In the town that
20–30% of
20–30%
local
in
income.
the town where I've done most of my work in Fujishima, which is a commercial town with maybe 50 or 60 smaller settlements. The largest sort of gross town product is produced by the Stanley Electric Company, and it has been for some time. Agriculture is a distant second to the economic importance and the employment importance of that one factory. In second place, I suppose, would be the town office, the Yakuba, which employs a great number of people and which is more important for funneling money from the prefecture and from Tokyo into non-agricultural things like hot springs and cultural centers and community centers than it is to protect or encourage agriculture. So I think for some time agriculture's importance in the local economy has been overstated, and for political reasons perhaps deliberately overstated. So again, the effect of the national government in finally putting the screws to real agriculture is probably not as great as some people fear.
What about on a wider level? One of the many phrases I like from your Daedalus article, where you're talking about rice subsidies and rice growing. You say growing rice makes more sense culturally than agriculturally. And if subsidies for growing rice are completely eliminated, you've already had a massive cutback in acreage. What does this do then to rice culturally?
Well, I actually meant several things by that particular phrase. One of which has to do with the what you might call the class consciousness of people who see themselves as farmers and farm families. Although a lot of our conversation is about irrigation and agriculture and rice, I've never seen myself as an ethnographer of rural Japan, or worse yet, of village Japan. I've always seen myself as an ethnographer of regional Japan. And to be a regional in mid to late 20th century Japan is a very complicated position to be in and to negotiate. There are all sorts of currents and cross currents that in which one has to swim to be of the regions and to be a regional person, to have some regional identity. And what you've cited is a good example. People who call themselves Noka farm families are really combining, to use a bit of jargon, a sense of themselves as petty bourgeois, as proprietors, small landholders and property owners on the one hand, and proletarians, workers, laborers on the other, because the rice land that they hold and the small part of the year that they spend tending to their rice paddies has a very important part of their sense as as a landed sort of smallholder proprietor, and it comes from, in part, the land reform that changed tenants into landowners at a very political time when slogans and institutions of democracy made much of these new landholders on the one hand, and yet the reason that they can do that is that most of them hold jobs at Stanley Factory and other places where they are technicians and clericals and truck drivers and construction workers when they are workers, and in a sense to remain and to insist upon themselves as farmers, albeit very part-time farmers, is a way of putting forward one part of their identity and backgrounding another part of their identity. So in the sense that part-time farming as the cultural cost of the elimination of agriculture will probably at this point be much more than the agricultural or economic cost of agriculture.
Well, that's what I find myself more and more fascinated by. There was a kind of logical set of links between rice, and we are a rice-eating people, and agriculture then links to the notion of the furusato, the old home village.
Right.
And if those links are broken, what happens to the old home village? And if the old home village goes, what happens to the whole national ideology that, again, to way overstate the case, said, we're a different kind of industrial society because we evolved out of the furusato and sedentary, peaceful, harmonious, rice-eating peoples as opposed to those cowboys in the West.
Well,
what happens to the ideology then?
That's another one of the difficulties or the ambivalencies of being a regional in late 20th century Japan, at the same time as the national government is celebrating them as the old furusato with the thatched roofed farmhouses and the collective enterprises and the communal solidarity. They have also been building new public schools, projecting the national curriculum and educational aspirations into these villages. The people who live there have been equally enthusiastic in embracing this modernization of their lifeways. And so these two things have been going on at the same time. And to the degree to which they can be done simultaneously is the degree to which maybe people can get and maintain some control of their lives, but it's very difficult to pull off both becoming modern and remaining traditional.
Yeah, but my impression for the 2 or 3 regions I know fairly well is that people by and large have managed that pretty effectively.
People have, yes. Not always in the terms that the Ministry of Education or the Culture Affairs Agency would like them to. But
you see, what I'm sensing now in the early 1990s is that living standards are no different anymore, not significantly. Incomes are still generally lower in the regions than in the metropolitan areas, but everybody's got television and running water and 3 or 4 cars and a pickup truck and so on. They're not, in no way can people living out in the regions be labeled backward and needing to be brought up. That's done now.
That's right.
But I'm not sure what comes next then.
There are other dimensions to the attitudes of the center to the regions, some of which in fact could be described as looking down upon them. The ways in which the people of regions like Shonai struggle to position themselves in the national education system is at considerable disadvantage to their cousins of the parents, brothers or sisters who are now in Tokyo. The leading high school in Shonai is South High School of Tsuruoka, has 220 kids graduating each year. It is at the pinnacle of the local pyramid. And last year, 120 of them were ronin or went to Yobiko.
Couldn't get into the college
couldn't get into the college of their choice,
so had to stay out and go
and
to
chose to stay out and go
tutoring
on. These
school
are
or
the
something else.
these are the best trained, best educated kids of Shonai. The top of a winnowing process that begins at least in late elementary school, and having gotten to that stage, find themselves at the bottom of yet a
Of the
larger
national
pyramid,
yeah.
and have to struggle for a year, several years, in order to get a foothold in the kind of university education that will, and this is another dilemma of the regions, often take them outside of Shonai. That is,
Yeah.
that's one of the, obviously any parent is torn between wanting the best for their kids, encouraging them to do as well as they can in the schools, doing the work themselves, that is the adults doing the work themselves, not following farming or whatever. But the cost is that to the degree to which they do well, the chances that they will leave Shonai are ever greater.
Are very good, yeah.
And so how a region is to compete successfully, develop its human resources, which is a rather perhaps inappropriate word for its people, and yet not then lose them, having done that, is to me one of the major challenges that face them and face regionals in other advanced societies.
It's something I've heard
like
from
Europe and
not
the
only
US.
regional officials but people in general in a number of areas. Although I've also been interested, at the same time they would say one of the ideals they hold for their kids is that the ideal career would be go to Tokyo or Osaka, Kyoto, get your degree from a reasonably good university, if not one of the top ones, then come back and become a city hall official.
Right.
Because that's the most stable and honored kind of local career track. Whether in fact people are able to do that easily, I don't know. But this was the idea.
Well, that's why, one reason why Prime Minister Nakasone's efforts to privatize various things and reduce the size of government agencies struck such terror in the hearts of people in the regions, because in the post-war period, these town offices and agencies and prefectural agencies had grown in size to incorporate people of just those sorts of ambitions. And these were secure, white-collar jobs that could, the only kinds of jobs that could attract those sorts of people back from the metropolitan areas. And when the size of the local town office was frozen, and then slowly reduced in the 1980s, it produced an enormous amount of anxiety and ill will among the people in the area of Shonai that I'm most familiar with.
Over the years, has there been sort of one big question that you're kind of, in all the little things you're doing, there's this one big question that you keep asking yourself about Japan?
Well, I don't think it's any more profound than a continuing curiosity about the social and cultural dynamics of a local society. If there is one theme that perhaps retrospectively, in part retrospectively, in part prospectively, it has linked the stuff that I've done. It has been this interest in seeing Japan through the changing shape of a small region, for some of the reasons that we were talking about earlier. Japan has gone through a number of key transformations, the emergence of the Tokugawa state, the change in Meiji to a modern nation state, the changes after the war into what it sometimes described itself as a mass middle-class society. And to look at local society at each of those moments is a way of trying to understand or to trying to put in particular terms these more general social processes.
Knowing what you do, what you know now, if you were to go back in imagination and start over again, would you do it differently?
Probably not. It's hard to answer that question because it seems that field work, particularly one's first field work, is by nature, at least partly, serendipitous. And
I think all field
like
work
all
is.
field work, but especially as a somewhat anxious graduate student with the pressures that partly imagined and partly real to produce something of a dissertation that will get one a job. All of this comes to play in creating a certain creative energy that drives you through the period of time. It was obviously difficult. I think anyone who tries to combine doing historical and archival work and ethnographic field work in the same project ends up having to juggle quite a bit, and perhaps both sides may suffer somewhat. I guess anthropologists are always a bit nervous restless, but also nervous about being so committed to not only a single society, but a single area within the society that he or she will lose a comparative perspective. But I have those feelings every now and again, but the commitment in language and social relationships to Japan, the richness of the materials, the number of problems that remain unexplored, will probably keep me here for quite some time. It seems to me that in teaching as an anthropologist, in trying to position our work in Japan in the larger field of anthropology, that some of that we can preserve and sharpen our comparative perspective without necessarily doing field work in some other place.
Well, I wish you many more decades in Shonai. One of these days I hope to get up there and visit you.
Well,
But thanks for visiting me here.
Thank you very much.